Hello, everyone, and a sunny good afternoon from Munich. Welcome to TestBirds. Today we are talking about the European Accessibility Act, about compliance and testing strategies. My name is Volker Klavitter from TestBirds Marketing, and I would also like to welcome here Markus Steinhauser is our founder and is going to walk you through the webinar. Hello, Markus.
Hey, Volker. How are you?
I'm okay. All set, basically. The way it works, the presentation is about 35 minutes, and then you have the chance to ask any questions. Please drop them in the chat. You have that button on the right bottom, and then we try to answer all your questions. And now I think it's time for Markus. The stage is all yours.
Yeah, thanks, Volker, and also from my side, hello, everyone. I'm just going to share real quick. So we have a little bit of an old-fashioned slide deck to show you, but there's going to be some interesting stuff on there. So there we go. Okay, European Accessibility Act. And what we want to talk about today, so in the next half an hour roundabout, is a bit of an introduction into the topic. So I think there are some people here with different backgrounds, different knowledge. So we'll give a bit of an introduction into the topic. We'll talk about the EAA and what it means. And then also how different options of what we've seen, how you can get started with the topic. Plus at the end, a couple of examples of accessibility testing that we've been doing in the past and some of the learnings that we've had there. And then at the end, we'll also have some time for questions if you have any. So let's get into it. To get started, I have a quote from Sir Tim Berners-Lee, and he said that the power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. And the important thing to note here is that this quote is from 1997, so close to 30 years ago. And unfortunately, in a lot of ways, not a lot of things have changed when it comes to accessibility. I think there's been some development, there's been some improvement, but overall, there is still a long way to go. And therefore, now we're also being kind of forced to make some steps with the guidelines coming in place. Why is accessibility so important? So when you look at the numbers, then we have around about 1.3 billion people worldwide who live with a disability. So that in itself is already a huge amount of people, right? But then on top of that, there's more than 2.5 billion people that need some kind of assistive product, right? So it's really a lot of people in our own networks, but also worldwide that have certain needs. And then if we look at reality, we can see that around about 90% of all websites, for example, are not really barrier-free. And this number is not from 1997, but from this year, actually, right? So we have a situation where 1 year from now, it becomes mandatory for almost everyone to have an accessible product, but only 10% are there when we look at this number. And that doesn't really go together. So what's important when we talk about disability, and this is a theme I'm going to repeat again and again in the next half hour, is that a lot of things that we do, also when it comes to accessibility, they are intended for a certain group or a certain target group of people having certain needs. But in reality, it's also beneficial for a lot of other people. So we just saw the number with the kind of 2.5 billion people that are using assistive technologies. And this also relates to something called the curb cut effect, which is in this, like in the literal sense, it's a curb that has been cut down to kind of street level and was initially intended as a design for people using wheelchairs so they can cross the street safely. Right? But in reality, this is kind of a design or a feature that's being used by many people and is beneficial to many people and many more people than just the intended kind of target group or beneficiaries initially. And it's the same in that sense. If you think about user experience, usability, and topics like these, we typically design something around a special need, but oftentimes there are benefits that we didn't maybe even anticipate also for other people. And that's also true for accessibility topics. When you look at it, I mean, at least also I personally, I always think of kind of permanent disabilities when we talk about the topic, right? So someone being blind, someone being deaf, and so on. But then there's also actually a lot of people that have either temporary disabilities or there's a situational issue that makes someone kind of, yeah, using certain features. So if we take the first one, right, either someone is blind, but they could also have had eye surgery lately and therefore, cannot see very clearly, or you might just be in a very bright environment and therefore, we all know sitting outside with a laptop and it's hard to see the screen with the normal settings. That's one example. Or another one I kind of have very often myself is when you are either in a noisy environment or somewhere where it's not allowed to kind of, play out loud and you want to still watch something, you don't have your headphones with you, then you might want to use subtitles in a video that you're playing because you still want to hear kind of, or read in this case, what's going on. So looking at it this way, there's actually a ton of use cases, not only for people with permanent disabilities, but also these temporary and situational topics. So from a why should we, build accessible products point of view, I think the most important topic is inclusion, right? So everyone should be able and has the right to really access all of the things that everyone else is also accessing. So there needs to be inclusion. There needs to be kind of the same rights to access products and services that everyone else has. But also, even if we leave that aspect aside and we look at economic reasons, it makes a lot of sense to invest in accessibility, right? So we just had some numbers that show, I think, that pretty much all of us can expand their user base, their customers, their buyers, whatever the business model is. It leads to kind of improved user experience. It can also positively impact SEO rankings. And in the end, and we're coming to that in a moment, of course, it's now also becoming kind of the law and therefore mandatory, but that should not be a goal in itself. That's maybe just the trigger that we need at this point. So when we look at what makes something accessible, there are kind of four main principles that are important. First one is perceivable. So when we look at something, it needs to be perceivable by kind of everyone, right? And that means that things like also images and videos as kind of prominent examples, they also need to be perceivable by people that are blind or maybe deaf. Then the second one is operable, meaning that it needs to be operable kind of in the standard way, if we want to call it that. Like I have a mouse and I have a keyboard here in front of me, but also you need to be able to use it with other means, with assistive technology, maybe also just with your keyboard using the tab function and navigating through a page. So it needs to be operable for everyone. And it also needs to be understandable. And what that means is it relates to the content, for example. So I think many of you might be familiar with kind of easy, or what's actually the English term, simplified content, I think, on certain websites, for example, from kind of the official radio stations, if you look at Germany. So it's about content, but it's also about, for example, the navigational structure, right? So is the navigation consistent across the product? Can I know how it looks by kind of looking at it or reading it once and then navigating to another page, and it's kind of the same setup, and I don't have to read every page again and again. So it needs to be understandable. And the last one is robust. And that means that it needs to be compatible with a lot of different tools and a lot of different situations. So it's not supposed to be just kind of optimized for example, one screen reader, and then people using other screen readers can't really use it properly. Those four principles, they're kind of always at the basis when we look at usability, and then also later on when we look at accessibility, and when we then look at accessibility testing. So let's talk about the European Accessibility Act for a little bit. How it's described officially is that it says it's an act or a directive that aims to improve the functioning of the internal market for accessible products and services by removing barriers created by divergent rules in member states. That's the official text. What it means in the end is we want to create kind of a level playing field, an inclusive situation where products and services are there and can be accessed by everyone, regardless of disability or not. And one of the, I think, questions that we all ask ourselves is, who does it apply to? And the answer is it applies to pretty much everything or everyone, depending on what you look at. There are some exceptions, for example, very small companies, also companies that do not sit but also do not operate in the EU. So European Accessibility Act in that sense is a EU directive. But if you're a company that sits somewhere else in the US or in Asia or wherever, and you do operate or offer services then in the EU, it still applies to you, right? So it's the kind of the market principle that we also have for things like the GDPR, for example. And then there are also some exceptions when it comes to kind of private internal services like intranet, for example, that are not currently covered by the EEA. Everything else is pretty much included. It includes both digital products, but also offline products like a computer or a smartphone or kind of ATMs. However, maybe also as a disclaimer, when we talk about it here, we mostly refer to the digital products. And also when we test it, our experience lies with testing digital products. Okay, so timeline point of view. Already some time ago in 2019, the directive was passed or approved by the EU, and then member states, this is how this always works, right? They have to implement it on a local member state level, this directive. And that basically then happened afterwards. And what's now interesting is we are currently in 2024, right? And bit less than 1 year from now, so end of June 2025, the kind of the guideline goes into place, and all new products that are launched after that deadline need to adhere to, or they need to be accessible in the end. And there's an important distinction there. So it's for all new products starting next year in June. And then there's actually a 5-year transitioning period that also then applies to existing products. So there's this grace period for products that are already on the market, maybe for a long time. And then by 2030, everything needs to be accessible, and then kind of encompasses everything that we use, for example, then in the digital space. So what's important when we talk about the EAA is that it is based on something called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG guidelines. And these WCAG guidelines, they've been around for some time. I think the first version was published in 1999. And since then, there have been a couple of iterations. So currently we are at WCAG 2.2, and they are kind of the basis or the underlying principles for implementing accessible products. And this is also what the European Accessibility Act is based on in the end. So when we think about, okay, how can we become or build accessible products, we need to look at the accessibility guidelines, but not only the guidelines, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Staying with the guidelines for now, there are 3 different levels. There's the A level, and this is kind of the basics. It covers the basics like alternative text for images, also making it perceivable for people looking at, or that cannot maybe look at videos. So some of the basic stuff. And then there's kind of the double A standard, and that covers, or is supposed to cover, a wide range, so that a product that has kind of the double A standard implemented should be usable by many, many people, because it should be accessible for the majority of people. However, it's not 100% accessible, and also probably 100% accessibility is almost impossible to achieve. But there is also the AAA standard that then kind of tries to get very close to that level, and it basically covers also difficult topics that are difficult to realize from an operational point of view or from a development point of view. However, AAA is probably not practical for everyone at all the time. When we look at how much effort or cost is it versus what does it bring. So, you can also think about the 80-20 rule, where 80% you can do, or you can get to 80% pretty quickly, but for the last 20%, you need almost the same amount of time again. So I think that's comparable. And then looking at the European Accessibility Act, the goal status is the AA standard in the end, right? And these WCAG guidelines, they are a set of guidelines that cover all of these different aspects, and they can be kind of the guideline, as I just said, or the starting point, and the more or less the checklist that you need to go through if you want to make something accessible. All right, so when I mentioned this in the beginning, when we talk about getting into the topic of accessibility, I think it's important that we really take it as something that is an ongoing process that we need to integrate into our processes, and not a one-time thing. So it's not something that we now, kind of for the upcoming deadline next year, we need to get to a certain state and then we're kind of done. But it's something that needs to be integrated and then continuously also considered when we think about digital product development. Same as for the GDPR topic, you need to implement certain standards, but then it's actually a continuous process to uphold that standard, or also work within the kind of the rules that exist. So I don't know, you might be someone that is already into the topic, you have a certain amount of knowledge, maybe also more than I have, and you want to then do something with it, and start implementing and working on these topics. I think, and this is maybe often forgotten, the most important part is really this starting point where you need to build awareness, get other kind of accessibility champions involved, and almost something like start a movement a little bit. So if you're the only person trying to fight for something, in this case accessibility, it's going to be very hard to actually get something done, right? So you need commitment from your peers, but probably also from kind of certain stakeholders in the company to really put this on the radar. And I think here, the guideline coming into place is a good starting point, because it's just going to be mandatory. So there's really no way around it. But then we also need to create awareness why it's important and what also positive effects it can have for us, even from an economical point of view. Then I think, we need to know where we stand. I've seen some companies and some people that really need to start from scratch. Others have already implemented certain things because they are relevant not only from an accessibility point of view. So you can do an initial assessment here. And when we look at the WCAG guidelines, there are certain also automated tools that can be used. Some of them are also free. and they are able to, let's say, catch quite a lot of the basic stuff already in an automated way, right? You can just type in your website, it'll walk through it and find the most obvious accessibility issues. And you can probably get something like, I've seen people say 25%, but I've also seen people say 50% or up to 50% of the accessibility issues that you need to fix. You can also do it in an automated way, right? And then you need someone with a certain amount of knowledge to have a manual look at it as well. So there's a lot of experts out there. That's also something we can potentially do, but there's a variety of also consultants and so on. And they look at it and they take the WCAG guidelines and, compare status quo to what the goal is. And then we can take it from there. And the important part is really to integrate it and work closely with things like the development team, the product owners, and people, working on changing a certain process. And then in the end, it can be treated like any other issue, whether it's a usability issue, whether it's a bug or defect that's found, right? Things need to be prioritized. They need to be kind of scheduled into your sprints or whatever methodology you use, and then they need to be fixed. And not everything will be able to be fixed, but it's a continuous process. I think once you get there, you're already pretty far or much further than most companies are today. Like 1 year from the European Accessibility Act coming into force. But then a crucial point from our point of view is really to also involve affected people, right? So testing with real users is essential, I think, in any case, but especially also in this situation, because only because something is accessible according to a certain guideline does not mean that it's really accessible and usable in a good way for someone affected. There's a difference. The same goes if we look at usability topics, right? There are certain usability methodologies. You can consider them when you develop your products, but then you still need to see how real people use it, because most likely there's a discrepancy between the theoretic part and then people doing stuff that wasn't really expected, or having a situation or a use case that wasn't considered initially. So testing with real users is there also key. And from my point of view, if I would rather have really affected people use a product and give a thumbs up that they can use it, that tells me at least as much or maybe more than only knowing that I'm now AA standard certified or kind of compliant, but not knowing whether actual people can also use it well in practice. And that brings us to kind of the last part already, and this would be testing with real people. So I don't know how much you know about TestBirds, and I don't want to make it a sales pitch here, but generally what we do is we have a large community of people, including also people with certain disabilities, and the goal is always to test certain products under real world conditions, right? With real people, real devices, and so on. And when it comes to accessibility testing, there are certain challenges attached to doing such testing that you don't have necessary for other testing types with real users also, right? So on the one hand, you have very narrow target groups. So it's overall a large amount of people worldwide, but if you look at a certain population, then it's not the majority of people. So you need to be able to identify and find these people in your country or in your certain market that you're operating. And then looking at the methodology that you're doing, you also then need to consider people's situations, right? So you can do testing with people regarding visual content. You can test stuff like screen readers. You can look at navigation. It goes back to these 4 POUR principles, like the operating principles, and other stuff like audio, media. So it's important to consider these different aspects and not only focus, for example, focus on only one topic and then cover that. And then you need to consider the circumstances these people will be testing under, right? So, for example, if you set up an interview with a blind person, you need to invest just more time in the beginning for the technical setup to make sure you can see what they're doing, that they're sharing the right things, that audio is working, and all of these things. That's, I think, a challenge in any case, but in this case, it just needs a bit more attention. And then also when you go into, for example, an interview with someone, you need to be mindful of their situation, right? Because they cannot see what you're seeing if they're blind, or they cannot hear you, for example. So then you wouldn't be able to do an interview like this with a deaf person. You need to find another way of communicating there, for example, in a written study. So there's a lot of stuff to consider. But in any case, I think doing something is better than just not doing it at all, because it can also feel daunting to, get into it and not do something wrong. I think, we're all making mistakes, and what I've seen in the past is people appreciate it if you try, right? So if as a company or as a department you try to make something better, that will be appreciated. So I have two examples now of tests that we've done in the past, and I would just quickly summarize what happened there to give you a bit of a feeling for what we typically do to test them with affected people. In this case, we had moderated user sessions, so remote interviews, you could also call it. We had 10 people from different countries, actually. So there was Germany, there was Brazil, Portugal, the US, China, and the UK. So very little amount of people from each of these countries. And then we had 5 use cases that we walked through in the moderated session. So 5 kind of, situations or 5 tasks that someone should go through. And the focus for this specific test was actually quite narrow, because it was focused on the tab navigation and the coloring of the tabs. There was basically, you see this also in the chart, red, blue, purple, and so on, tab colors, and the goal was to find out what people can use best in their respective situations. There were 3 prototypes for this that were compared with the different users. And in the end, the red kind of coloring was the favorite for most people. I think that's also important maybe to note. There's not always one solution that works best for everyone. You need to find what works best for the majority, maybe in certain situations, and then consider, what kind of topic we're talking about and what's reasonable to implement at this point in view. And one side note maybe here, because I was reading the final report for this study a couple of days ago, and one of the findings in our test there was actually that most people didn't think that accessibility is a must-have, because they are so used to everything not being accessible. And they've gotten used to it, and they try to work around it, right? And if you think about it, that's not how it should be. That people kind of give up or face reality and say, okay, I don't care so much, because that's what it looks like almost everywhere. And flipping this around, if you then are a company that does really well in this case, there's a very high chance that you're gonna get a new client or user, or make a sale, whatever it is, because you stand out now at least, and probably also still a year from now, because not everyone will be able to get there in time. Okay, and then the second study was also a moderated session. Moderated sessions do make sense if possible in the circumstances, just because there's a certain amount of guidance that we can give as a moderator. In this case, we had 6 people, and it was an e-commerce website, and the setting or the test setup was a bit more open, and it also just had one use case, and the use case was basically that you want to find an outfit for a wedding, please go and do it. So it was very open how people would navigate and how they would get to that goal of buying a wedding outfit. And there we had people with different disabilities, both kind of visual and auditory, but also cognitive when it comes to content and so on. And I've brought, unfortunately, this was done not in English, but we translated a quote of one of the participants. And I just wanted to share that with you because I think it highlights kind of well what some of the struggles are that people go through. I'm just going to read it real quick. So what the user was saying was that, first of all, not all graphics have an alternate text, right? For example, you see things like slide 1, which I wouldn't notice, but people that navigates differently than just, in this case, it was a blind tester. They just hear slide 1, and that doesn't really help them. And then the second thing is that the menus are not links, but clickable. There are no landmarks, navigation menus, hamburger menus, no clear heading structure. And that means that such a user, they cannot navigate properly on this product because every page is different. They don't know what each thing stands for. So going page by page, they basically have to learn what's on each page from scratch every time. And that's not a good way of navigating because it's very time intensive. So this goes back also to this principle of things need to be perceivable, for example, for kind of all kinds of users. So, excuse me. So this needs to be considered. And I think, at least for me, the best way to kind of have a realization what makes sense is then to actually talk to people and find out what their needs are. And that already brings us to almost the end. I have kind of 3 outcomes for you, or maybe a short takeaway. So on the one hand, the clock is ticking because we got a bit less than 1 year until the European Accessibility Act is enforced. However, that should only be kind of the trigger, I think, for everyone, because as we've seen, accessibility is a topic that addresses a certain amount of the kind of population, but is also valuable for many other people. It also can have economic impacts or improvements for kind of us from a business point of view, and it's something that is here to stay. It's not going to go away, right? After we've done it once, it's here to stay. So it's really, I think, important that we think about how we can integrate it as a permanent topic into our processes. And yeah, having said that, we don't need to make it perfect from the beginning. I think getting into it and then improving on an iterative basis, like we do with many other things, is key here. Yeah, so thank you for listening so far. I hope there was some interesting stuff in there. And let's see, I think Volker is also back. What questions we have so far.
Yeah, thank you very much, Markus. I think during the chat we already had some really good questions, comments, and also findings on everything. While you are maybe thinking about other questions, I dropped in some further readings from stuff that you find also on our website. I mean, what I basically took away as a big learning is that digital accessibility also offers a lot of opportunities in terms of, especially when you have large customer audiences, to really address everybody and also be more successful on the market when you really look into accessibility. Let's dive into the questions. I think I'm gonna go top down. We had some comments about WCAG 2.1 and 2.2. Do you want to comment anything on this? I think our colleague Jana already answered on this one. Otherwise, I would go to the next one concerning reading the EAA. It does currently not reference any technical standards, but only annex, which described, technical standards that will be applied. And it's so basically what you said, everything is still in the flow, yeah, because the law has been, or let's say not the law, but not everything has been formulated in the final way. That kind of reminds me a little bit on GDPR introduction a couple of years back. What would you say about this topic, Markus?
Yeah, I mean, regarding the guidelines, they're continuously being developed, and we also saw that the European Accessibility Act, it's from 2019, right? Actually, now they're already working on the version 3.0 of the standards, but they're not finished yet. So, from my point of view, at least, it makes sense to work with the current guidelines if you get into accessibility. But it's true that initially it was based on 2.1, and otherwise, when it comes to the technical definitions or guidelines that should be followed, that is definitely one of the challenges, because you cannot just do method A now and do exactly these 10 things and then you're basically done, right? Because also in the WCAG, if you look at it, some of the stuff is 1-0 black white, yes or no, is accessible or not, but a lot of the stuff is also, let's say, open for interpretation, how you implement it in a way that makes it accessible for certain people. So there's a lot of gray in between in a lot of ways where you need to make decisions whether you do it this way or that way, depending on your product, on your means, and your users also. And that relates to another question I've heard in the past, which was around, do I need to get certified for this? Maybe that's also part of the question. I don't know, but
it's another question. It's another question that somebody else asked. So it's good that you mentioned certification.
Yeah. So from the Act itself, there is no requirement to get a certain certification stamp or something like that. You need to make your product accessible based, for example, on these WCAG guidelines. And also with the WCAG guidelines, there are, in a lot of countries, there are local adaptations of these. And they are based on things in WCAG, but they are then, in Germany, for example, you have the BitV topic, and I also know that in other countries, there are other adaptations to the standard, right? So as I mentioned, there's not this one thing that you just follow, but you need to look at where am I, what is my local guideline, which is most likely very similar to the EAA, but it might be a little bit different in certain areas. And then you need to go into implementation, and there's no stamp basically that certifies you or that you need for the certification.
Okay. So I think that was killing a few birds with one stone, because we had a couple of questions going into that direction. Let's maybe scroll down a little bit further, because I think it also answered the question of one attendee asking whether how it infects QA. I think it's an additional part of your QA efforts that you need to do. Then scrolling a little bit down, we have, is this 2030 deadline applicable for all EU countries?
As far as I know, yes. Yeah.
Okay. And also another question. Do you recommend any specific audit-free tool for this initial check? I think yes. I need to look it up again. There are some. We discussed it, I think, in our previous webinar about that. And yeah, it's true. You get a lot of using these tools. I think that was like the bottom line about what we found out so far. Yeah, you get some of the cosmetic impacts delivered, but it's a rolling process. So the more you get into that, the more you will find out. So initially, you might be able to cover a lot of the basics, but then need to like deep dive into that. And we also have one question concerning if there are any penalties, like in GDPR, if you're not complying with the law.
Mm-hmm. It's also a little bit unknown still, and probably a little bit different in each country. But from like an official statement point of view, what I've read is that there will be certain, also in Germany, for example, there will be certain bodies government bodies that you can, and they are responsible for checking, similar to what it looks like for GDPR. Having said that, we know that they will not be able to check everything proactively, right? So my expectation is that either some users will complain to these bodies and then they will investigate specific examples where it's supposedly not accessible. And then they focus on these examples, and then they might also make some proactive stuff, but definitely they won't have the capacity to really do it on scale for everything. And in theory, you can get a warning, you can get a fine. I think what I've read is up to 100,000, but might also differ per country. And then they could even ask you to take down the product in the worst case, like take off your website offline or remove your product from the market. It's really hard to say how it will be applied in reality. From my point of view, if you can show that you've done something to improve accessibility, you can show that you've worked on it, you've made certain improvements already, but there might be an area that's not accessible yet for whatever reason. The risk is very low, I would say. If you have a situation where you just ignore everything and pray that you're not going to be noticed and you cannot prove that you've dealt with the topic in some way, then you might have an issue.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question, and I think it basically was answered in your presentation to some extent. How do you define what areas that we need to test during an accessibility test? Is it very similar to usability testing, or are there any specific scenarios you're following?
Yeah, it's a good question. Could probably do its own webinar on it. So it goes back always to these 4 principles on the one hand. So it needs to be like perceivable, robust, operable, and so on. And then it needs to be looked at from your specific use case point of view. Like I've made this example in the past where if you build a software for pilots, you don't need to include accessibility features for blind people, as a very very basic example, but I think there can be other nuances of this where not everything needs to be implemented 100% all the time, depending on the use case. So I think it makes a lot of sense to look at the specific product, what the users are or who the users are, and who should be able to access it, right? And then when testing, there are very broadly speaking those 2 areas. One area is this testing based on guidelines like the WCAG, which partly can be done automated and partly you need to look at manually. And the second component is then testing with your users, even if it's just 5 or 10 users initially, to see if they can actually use it. And one thing I wanted to mention also earlier, what then you can do as a company is you can publish an accessibility statement on your website. A lot of companies like insurance companies already do that. And it says, hey, this website is accessible in certain areas, but there might also be exceptions to it. And those are the exceptions. And that then is kind of a public statement, and it shows that you've worked on it, you've implemented a lot of stuff, but you're not 100% there yet, and you probably never will be.
Yeah, exactly. So I think this was the expansion of some of the participant questions. Additionally, it was asked how AI could help with implementing that. I'm not sure if any of those tools already have AI features built in, but maybe you have a better experience because you're very hands-on on the topic.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably different use cases for AI. I think it can help to get into the topic just as a research and kind of as a partner tool for thinking about how you can implement it in your existing processes. I don't think it will be, at least in the immediate future, it will not be able to do an audit because it's based on historic data and not live data, right?
Yeah.
So that still needs to be done in the ways I just mentioned, but it can be used to, for example, if you operate in multiple countries, to research in those countries regarding the local application of the laws and things like that. So it can be, I think, a good partner in implementation and getting ideas for what to do.
Yeah. And I think this pretty much puts together what you already said. It's about actually getting started. Use any of the tools, let it run across your site. Think about what it basically gives you as results and points to work on, and then identify target audiences who should, with certain incapabilities, like be able to use your website, be able to access your website, and basically do specific testing with them. I mean, as you mentioned in the first couple of tests, you should be able to identify 80% of what actual users will have problems with. And I think this is then an overall thing to implement in your UX and also QA processes.
Yeah, just the last couple of questions there, and I think we might call it a day, but regarding what exactly you need to implement, there the AA standard is the reference point, basically, from these guidelines. Like we had these three, A, AA, and
double, triple, exactly.
And that's kind of where you need to go. But from what I know, there is no exact percentage or something like that where if you get this 1 point, then you're accessible and you're approved, and otherwise you don't. It's kind of this process that I mentioned before, and that might change in the future, but that's how it is at the moment. So you don't get a stamp if you achieve X%.
Excellent. This is how it is now. Thank you, Markus. I think this could be our final wrap up. Thank you, everybody, for being here. If you have any other questions, you know how to get in touch with us. Have a lovely afternoon. Thank you very much, Markus, and thanks everybody for joining here. Goodbye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.